guys, so I have got a bit of probably a longer video today, and it's another one of my book versus film reviews. So you hear that my cat Elsa's going a bit berserk. The windows are open and it's quite windy and I think she's like, someone's in the house. So I'm going to be reviewing the book and the movie for Lolita by Vladimir Nobokov. I don't think I can pronounce his surname very well, so sorry if I do pronounce it wrong. So wow, where do I begin? So I'm going to be starting with the book. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars and it was such a crazy experience. So funnily enough, I'd actually watched the movie years ago first, and I didn't really know how to process that. I was only like 13 or 14 when I watched it, and yeah, it was like a slumber party sort of situation. I was like, let's watch it, and we watched it and it was like, we didn't know how to feel about it. Obviously then I wouldn't have known how to process my thoughts. I still don't quite know how to process my thoughts right now, but it's cool to have that reflection of seeing it then at a similar age to our main character, Dolores, and now as like a older person reading it and watching it again with like fresh eyes. So if you don't know what Lolita is about, it is like a fictional account, basically writing. Our main character is Howdee-haie and he is writing his love story, as you will, with 12-year-old Dolores Hayes. You get the gist from the beginning that he has been incarcerated and he is kind of trying to plead to you as the judge and jury why what he has done isn't really that bad, which it obviously is, because we are following the story of a paedophile and his ever further involvement with a child. And that's kind of the base, and that instantly puts people off, as you know it should do. It is a very uncomfortable conversation starter. It's a very uncomfortable book to read at times, and it's unsettling, especially for people that have had similar situations. I totally understand how it can be triggering, but in terms of looking at it as, I think this is a Penguin essential. It's like a modern classic. It is an interesting book to kind of see the character study of a person with these characteristics that are seen and should well be as disgusting and monstrous. So it's hard to say I enjoyed it, because who enjoys reading about paedophiles? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, I didn't enjoy it in that regard, but it was a very interesting character study if you can stomach the subject matter. So reading it, it did take me quite a few months, just because being such a heavy topic, and also the way it's written isn't the easiest way to read. It just took me a while. I had to keep putting it down, especially when we get into scenes that were definitely going on to explicit with what he was doing with Dolores. But yeah, it's just strange. I found the actual writing style to be very lyrically written, so it kind of took you out a little bit, because you'd be reading a passage and you'd think, wow, that sounds like poetry, that sounds so beautifully phrased, and then you'd realise what you're reading again and it's just like, whoa. And that in itself, I feel, shows cleverly the manipulation of our fictional main character Humber, because he is again kind of narrating this story for you in the outlook that he is in prison, waiting a trial, waiting a sentence, and he's kind of coming to you, trying to sway you, I guess, in giving him a lesser sentence. So when you kind of look at it subjectively like that, you can see the manipulation of how he is beautifully phrasing these things. So Howdee-haie, he has actually come to America, and he's pursuing, like, I think he's a writer, but at the minute he is, in the beginning stage of the book, he's pursuing this sort of career within a relations perfume factory. You learn a lot about his early life before he came to America, about his previous marriage, and also as a child. One of the main themes of this book is nymphets, and this kind of desire and alluring attributes that these young girls between a certain age have, and that he calls them nymphets. And you kind of see in the very beginning how this infatuation began and why. It's no excuse to what he does in this book and how he thinks, but you can sort of see how these circumstances have shaped this character, which is really interesting to see. It's strange because as a person, Humbert is trying to convince you that he is not the typical pervert that you would assume who preys on the young. He is a gentle, soft man who cannot help the desire and love that he feels for the young girls, which is so twisted in itself. Yes, he may be a gentle person in nature and spirit, but he is still thinking these things and actively working on them to get this end goal, which he knows is wrong. And it's so strange again because he is such a self-aware character. He knows what he's doing is wrong, and at times as well he even tries to convince you. And as you see, Dolores, I'm going to call her Lo probably for the rest of this, he's trying to convince her that it's a normal thing. They used to do this in ancient civilizations where they'd marry off their young to produce offspring, blah 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 blah. And he kind of uses that as why it should be justified today. And he even says, Lo, like, if we get caught, you're going to get sent to a horrible home for delinquent children that nobody wants, and I'm going to get sent to prison because people aren't basically on our wavelength. They don't understand what we're doing is like pure, and it should be normal. And it's times like those where you really see the kind of monstrous acts of this character, and yeah, it's just a really strange and interesting book to kind of slowly read through. So Humbert obviously shows some very appalling traits, but one scene that I read that really kind of threw me for a loop, that showed me, it sent me shivers really down my body, was a particular scene where him and Lo had an argument, and it was pouring down with rain. Lo just ran out of the apartment, she got her bike and rode off, and he viciously ran after her. But it was like you could really see how far he had degraded in his psychosis. Basically you could see how paranoid he had become, how craved with desire and obsession he had become in his mind, because he starts chasing after her in the rain, no coat, nothing. He just goes straight out there after her, which at first reading it, you would run after a child if they've gone out in the dark after an argument, yes, but then you've got that layer of obviously he is having sexual relations with this child, he has groomed her, he's basically keeping her just in this room. She's not like locked in, she goes to school and stuff, but it's a very controlled environment. So with that layer on it, it's even more sinister. And he's running after her, and there's a particular time where he turns and he sees this corner and he sees this girl being kissed by this young boy, and he is filled with anger and revenge, and it's not Lo, he realises. And that instant you're just like, whoa, this guy is a monster. Like, it really shows you, if it hadn't shown you before, which I don't know how you could have missed it, this scene for me was like that point where I was like, whoa, it took me back, and it's, as I said, it sent shivers down my spine. Again, I think a few reviewers I'd seen that had reviewed this on Goodreads had said, as I've mentioned, he is a very self-aware character, and he's taken time to convince you guys, you know, as a reader, as this pretend jury that's in this fictionalised setting, that he is a good person. He just has this longing to fulfill something that he was missing as a child, and it's turned into this. But he's very unapologetic of it. He knows it's wrong, and he's just, it's not like, you can't say he just doesn't care, because he cares, and he has so many feelings that he talks about in this book, but he doesn't care to change how he is. You know, he wants to continue pursuing this, and even has, I believe, conversations like spotted throughout where if he was to somehow lose Lo, he would find another one. And he even mentioned getting her pregnant at one point, and then doing what he's done to her to their child. And it's just, it's so very, very disturbing content, but again, interesting for conversation, I would say. So those are sort of my thoughts on the book itself. I feel like I couldn't get this. It had a very somber tone, which it probably should for something of this sort of tone. But I just, I don't know. I do have a written review on Goodreads if you are interested in kind of seeing a bit more of a breakdown, detached a little bit. But as I talk about this, I instantly get emotional, and yeah, that definitely does come across in my approach right now. So yeah, this was a 5-star read, a very hard 5-star read, and it doesn't come from one of like enjoyment and like wow adventure. It's more of the quality and content of how it was written, the important themes and messages that were discussed in this through the storytelling, and yeah, that sort of approach, I think, and just being like a groundbreaking kind of, I guess you would say, taboo piece of literature. It's definitely, yeah, definitely an interesting Penguin Essential read, for sure. So on to the film now. This is where I am going to get spoilery, because I am going to compare, most likely. I can't help comparing, and I'm obviously going to go into a bit more scene by scene points that I'd like to discuss. So if you haven't read the book or seen the film, or you just don't want spoilers at all, please skip this part, although it does defeat the kind of purpose of this book versus movie review, so it's up to you. The movie as well, I actually gave a 5 stars. So both book, both movie had a 5 stars. They were quite up there on par. So just jumping straight in, you already know what the synopsis is. The book and the movie are quite well attuned together. I feel like the adaptation of the novel was very well done. I really found it beneficial that they kept at the beginning about Annabelle in this, because as I mentioned just lightly in the first part of this review for the book, arguably it gives context to Humbert's obsession with the idea of nymphets, sort of where that manifested, what happened to kind of cause a short switch in his mind to make this feel this way. It's small and subtle, but I do think it is an important part. You might watch it or read it or whatever and think, this is so irrelevant, why is he discussing this like years and years ago failed love story or whatever? But it definitely kind of signifies a little bit about what changes him or what influences him as a person and what he thinks is acceptable as he grows, you know. I believe in this, Humbert goes straight to Beardsley for a teaching post, whereas in the book, as I've already mentioned, I think he goes to America for just to get to another country, make a name for himself and stuff, and then he eventually finds lodgings with Lo and her mother Charlotte, and that's where the plot kind of begins, and the meeting of Lo and the slow kind of grooming of her begins. As I mentioned before, I have actually seen this movie before when I was like 13 or 14, and I just felt so awkward and confused, but it opened up this curious fear in me at the time, where it was just like an outward feeling of like abstractly that could have been me, just because I was the age group of her. And obviously it's just weird, like putting yourself in that place and thinking, wow, this is so strange a concept to understand. But it was more overwhelming and uncomfortable to think at that time, but now I can sort of, again, abstractly, subjectively look at it without feeling too attached, even though I still am getting kind of emotional about it. It's weird, but yeah, it was just at that time, watching it at that age group, it was just a bit too much. So I probably wouldn't recommend watching it as a kid. Again, I wouldn't have watched it on my own. It was just I was at a sleepover and we were just like, oh, let's watch it, and you know, you find strength in numbers. So because we do skip the preamble of his life before Humbert goes to America, we get to the point rather quickly and kind of abruptly actually. Within about half an hour of the film starting, we kickstart with basically Charlotte's death and the follow-up of Lo's kidnap pretty much straight after that. But despite this, as briefly mentioned before, it is very true to the novel, I would say, which is something quite extraordinary actually, because oftentimes I found I could quote word for word the dialogue that was becoming like in the film, and I quite liked that, because you know, it's good when a film kind of deviates a little bit from a book and it has its own uniqueness. But I think for something like this, for what it's trying to do, I appreciated it being more true to it. I hope that made sense. It's a funny thing really, because most times I felt uncomfortable reading the book more than watching the film. I don't know, I think maybe just in your head you see things more, maybe not more vividly, but your imagination runs wild with what you're reading, and it kind of gives you certain pictures that are more intense maybe than you can actually make out in real life. And I also think it's because in the book you're completely in Humbert's mind. You're in his head, just his alone, and so it's kind of refreshing on screen to not be that involved and have a bit more detachment. Even though you are watching uncomfortable scenes, it doesn't feel as intrusive in your mind. Maybe I think that's how I felt it, and hopefully I've got my thoughts across well. So we have this kind of plot development where as Lo and Humbert are on, basically not on the run, but he's essentially kidnapped her and they're kind of living out of motels and stuff. It becomes clear that someone is following them, and instantly Humbert thinks it's a detective, it's the FBI, they're going to be caught, he's going to get sent to prison, she's going to get sent away from him, and he cannot be without his Lo, his Lolita, his Dolly. He cannot leave her side, she cannot leave him. So he becomes, this is kind of like the start, or the obvious start of this paranoia. And I understood eventually who was pursuing the two far better in the movie than when I was reading the book, because it felt more straightforward in the film, and I also had a face to remember. Whereas in the novel they seem to use different names, different aliases, you know, especially that Humbert kind of gave him as little code names when he was sort of fabricating who it could be, that I felt the reader had to follow, and I didn't personally follow very well. So when the big reveal was made in the novel, it wasn't as impactful for me as I felt like it could have been, because I hadn't originally made that connection between the pursuer and the vital character who it came out to be. So I felt like in the film, watching it, remember faces, maybe it was a little bit more obvious who they were discussing earlier as to who, like, before it was connected. It was a bit more of like an oh whoa moment, because I really saw the connections. I kind of needed it a little bit more spelled out to me, I think. But I think it was also difficult to follow along because I was taking so many breaks, and so many lengthy breaks between picking up the book again. So probably that was a bit of a disconnect there from my reading experience personally. I feel like the film really does show how manipulative Lo is as well. Again, just to reiterate, that does not make it at all okay for what Humbert did to her in this book, and did to her repeatedly. But I felt really sad actually watching her, basically for extra pocket money she would do things to him, and I felt sad because she must have learnt that offering herself is the only way she'd get things. And I don't know, that just, viewing it in that point really made my heart break a little bit. So I've got an interesting fact here that I read when I was looking up some information about the film, and it said since actress Dominique Swain was only 15 at the time of filming, which is disturbing to know. I went to know how old she was, and that's still very young. A pillow had to be placed between her and Jeremy Irons' lap during all their scenes together. In the novel, Lolita is only 12 when Humbert first meets her. In the film, her age was changed to 14. And I guess the latter was to kind of make it less, not less shocking, but like, obviously it has that shocking taboo, but, and that essence to it, but I guess because she's not super underage, it isn't as strange a thought. Maybe it made it more like viewable, I guess, if you know what I mean. These are none of my like thoughts, but that's the only way I can imagine them thinking it's okay just to increase her age a little bit from the book. And also I guess getting someone young enough to look 12, you'd have to get like someone younger than 15, I guess, and that's just even more uncomfortable, weirder situation. Do you know what I'm saying? I think hopefully you know what I'm saying. But overall, yeah, I'd say that the movie takes on the tone of the book almost perfectly, perhaps missing out a touch on just how much Humbert declined mentally, as I feel like it didn't really show his growing paranoia as well as it did in the book. I guess you had more time with him in the book and you were so in his head that you could just see him breaking down mentally. However, in saying that, it kept the film less confusing, it simplified things a little bit more, and it was easier for a general audience, I would say, to follow along with. Again, if you have the stomach for it. Nevertheless, it is equally as disturbing as the book, and it displays very well this morally wrong character. 5 stars again for this, and perhaps even a stronger 5-star, just slightly, for this film in comparison to the novel, as it's just that bit more understandable and easier to digest as, say, your average consumer, one that's not very in tune with like classics as such. But yeah, that is my review for my book versus movie for Lolita. A very difficult one. Every other one has been a little bit more light-hearted and fun, I think, but this one I tried to be as, not scholarly, because I am not like, I don't have a degree or anything in English, but I tried to be as critical a bit more as I possibly could. I know I probably missed off a lot of the points that I could have mentioned. I just hope my words come across how I mean. But yeah, let me know what you thought of Lolita. Did you think the movie adaptation was one that was well inspired, well executed? And yeah, I'd love to know what you think. So yeah, I'll speak to you in another video soon. Bye.